I think I'm going to speak on codependency because I heard people talk about it. And it's something I think that I feel like I know a little about given my background. And I call codependency disease of lost self. And I think as therapists, one of the things that I got drawn into, and I watch other therapists get drawn into, is to hear, one side, we have clients come in and they're talking about the victimization that they have, whether it be, and you'll see this a lot more, I think, in addicted relationships, okay? But they don't have to be. They can be between a parent and a child and a parent, even to spouses where there is no addiction, and yet there is a high level of codependency. And I think we have to be aware of those because I don't want to blame things on the codependency, but I think it's really important to be able to help them to change the narrative where they're feeling like a victim, and to see where their part is. Now, one of the things that I think is really important, one of the things that I pick up and I talk to my supervisor about a little bit because it's something he asked me is like, how do you pick up somebody that's codependent, where there's a level of codependency? And I always say the difference between, people get married or in relationships, right? For a interdependency. A healthy relationship is interdependent. People get married because two people can usually raise a family better than one, okay? Yet when the relationships change from interdependence, which is a separateness, right, to codependence, it becomes unhealthy. And one person can feel suffocated while the other person can be overwhelming. And that's usually what happens as it develops into the long term. Because these things don't normally start out. Some start out really codependent. And those are usually the ones you see in addictive relationships where the two people are really connected to each other very quickly. But ones that develop over time, either with children or parents or with spouses, usually happen slowly and build up, and each party plays off themselves. And I think it's just real important. One of the things that I notice the first thing when I see a codependent relationship is I'll ask a person when they start talking about their spouse or whoever the person that they're in the relationship with, and I'll say, so how did, what do you think about that? Or how does that make you feel? And they'll talk about the person again. And every time as I direct them, right, to talking about themselves, the narrative always goes back to the other person and what the other person is doing. And I think that's sort of one of the first signs that you can see that somebody really has lost their ability to identify self. And usually what they're trying to do is, you'll see is that they have some sort of anxiety or some sort of loneliness that if they can just get that person to do what they want, they're going to feel better. It's like, well, I would feel, but, I had a mother and a very codependent relationship with the son, so much so that the son really didn't talk to her very much anymore because she was so obsessed with the son getting married because she needed that for her to feel better. She said, I asked her, says, so why does your son not want to talk? She said, well, he says every time I talk to him, I said, what is he doing about dating? Why is he doing? Who is he trying to set him up? He says, I don't really want to hear about it. And I said, well, so, you want a relationship with your son, but you're pushing him away. And, I said, how do you understand that? And we, again, she started talking about him and him not being happy and him not being able to do it. And I said, well, maybe he is happy being single. And she said to me, well, how can I be happy if my son isn't married? Which again was a real big understanding for me. I said, and question is, supposing your son never gets married, happy? And for her to sit there with that and was, not a question, because what happens is when somebody says, I can't be happy if my husband or wife or my son, says that you're basing your own happiness. Now, one of the lines that I use and that I use with people that I think is very strong is, when they come in and they start telling me how unhappy they are with their relationship and how upset they are at their spouse, and usually with spouses, And I will listen to them. And there are two lines that I use, which I think are helpful. And I'll listen to them for a while. And I said, I really understand why you're so mad at your spouse and why you feel so angry at them. And they get, they feel very good about the empathy, and they wait for me to say, I said, if I gave my spouse the amount of power over my feelings that you've given your spouse, and they don't listen, I'd be angry at them too. And they don't do what I want, I'd be angry at them too. And then I let them sit for a while, because that's what they're doing in essence. And they need to understand that. And that can start a talk with somebody, right? To be able to start understanding what they're doing. Because really what they're doing is placing the power of their self and the power of their feelings in the hands of somebody else. And they'll usually come up with, well, what can I do instead? And then the answer is, well, what do you think you can do? Right. And then we have to start talking about detachment, and detachment with love. Okay. Because a lot of times it's being able to separate ourselves. We can be emotionally involved. Well, we can be in love with somebody and be in a relationship with somebody and not be, and when I use the word emotionally involved, of course we get emotionally involved in their struggle, because their struggle is their struggle. We can be there with them. We can empathize with them. But when we try and fix their struggle, or be in there with them and let their struggle affect us, then it gets into an unhealthy relationship to an extent. I mean, again, when we're talking about levels of codependency, I think the other thing that I've used that I think is quite effective, is again, you'll see these things where people come in and they'll talk about whatever relationship they're codependent, and you'll direct them, and so help me understand how that makes you feel. What do you feel when he or she does? And they'll go again to not talk about their feelings and talk about what the person is doing or not doing that's upsetting them. And I'll usually let it go a session, and I'll get about halfway through the second session, and I'll mention to them something like, we've known each other now a session and 30 minutes, and that's about 80 minutes of therapy. And many times in that course, I'll ask you what you think or what you feel, and you talk about your spouse or your partner, whoever you're in with. And I said, I want you to tell me how many minutes you think you've talked about yourself, and how many minutes you think you've talked about your partner. And they'll think about it for a minute, and I'll try and keep a little bit of a track, and I'll say, well, how many minutes you think you've talked about yourself? And I don't know, and I'll usually go about 3 or 4, which is usually what it is. And again, that'll start the wheels turning because they know at some level, it's logic, just don't know an answer of how to change it. Now, I think some of the other signs that I see, again, in these codependent relationships, and it takes them, is to say, to sit down and somebody say, what would it be like to tell your spouse all the things that you're telling me about how unhappy you are and the way it makes you feel? Like, because as you can start to say, well, how does that make you feel? You can start to help them rebuild self. It's not what they're doing, it's what they're feeling when that person does it, and then how to regulate them, or give that message. Instead of trying to change the behavior of the spouse or the partner, it's to be able to give them the information of how they feel. And usually what they'll end up saying is, why should I tell them, he or her, the way I feel? They're not going to change. And again, it goes back into that, I need them to change the way I feel. And the work is, right, to help change the way you feel when they make the action, or to learn to accept the action so it doesn't make you feel the way you're feeling. And that's the process of rebuilding self. And it's really basically into, again, as the person starts redirecting, once you've had these talks into the session 2 or 3, I think is to help the person to redirect them again as they talk about that partner, into saying, okay, you're talking now again about your partner. What's going on for you, and what are you feeling when that happens, or when they say this, or when that, what's going on with you? And constantly keep on redirecting them back into an experiential place to help develop a sense of self, to know what's going on with them. a lot of times, like you said, you will see that these are the way people grew up in houses that they had very little self, and again got into relationships like that, because trauma usually brings on these codependent relationships, either abuse or addiction with a parent, or some such thing that usually ends up keeping a person lost within themselves because they're so overwhelmed with their own feelings that they learn to disregard them or to negate them or to try and change the behavior of a parent, again, to help them feel secure. So I think that's, one of the things that's helpful to me, and one of the things I think that I've developed over is a real understanding that we'd be able to see, when a person constantly is redirecting the conversation back to somebody else, it's a sign of codependency. Or I think one of the other things is when you ask them, what would it be like to tell their spouse or their partner, the things that you're telling me now that they've developed it, and for them to say, they're not going to listen, so what's the point? And my answer always is, who do you think needs to hear that? And it's amazing how they'll sit there for like blanked face and go, what do you mean? What do you mean, who needs to hear? They're not going to listen, so who needs to hear it? And at some point they may go, me, I need to hear that? And I say, yes, I think you need to hear yourself say that. What your spouse does is not as important as you being able now to give over what you're feeling, or what your needs are, right? Whether they act or not, right, is secondary, because that's going to let you what you need.